Hello from VK3AML. I hope I've got audio here. I'll just check. I'm checking everything preparatory to going live, which I will in 1 minute. And hello to anybody who might be on the stream. Nobody yet. Hello, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. And we've got the chimes working at last. Well, quite a few items to present tonight, both on 147.475, and if you want to look in on what we're doing here, YouTube Live. Look up YouTube Live. I should be found by any Google search if you put in the term VK3AML Live, L-I-V-E. That's 2 words, VK3AML Live, and that'll be the internet stream and the video. So what have we got for you tonight? Well, I thought we'd talk about Australian voices and specifically the history of the Australian accent. I have many examples, recorded examples of the Australian voice through the last century and a quarter. One of the earliest surviving is of a very unfortunate Australian soldier named Henry Miller Lancer, known to his friends as Miller. He grew up in Sydney, was born in Chatswood in 1890, and trained as a motor mechanic. Father lived at Robinson Street, Chatswood. And at the age of 24, of course, in 1914, he joined up 3 weeks after the declaration of war in the first AIF as a foot soldier on the 2nd of September 1914. He didn't know where he would be sent. He just volunteered to help his country through the crisis. Was sent for training in Egypt, having no idea of the fact that he'd be sent to Gallipoli or the sort of disaster that would turn out to be. And of all of the Australian servicemen who served in the First World War, only 2 were recorded during that time, and their records have survived. Henry Miller Lancer was one, who you're about to hear, and the other was recorded as a prisoner of war for a speech study done by some German scientists in Germany in 1916. But this is the earlier of the recordings, and quite a story behind it. When Lancer got to Cairo, he was in training there, and occasionally they'd have days off to go through the streets of Cairo. They'd buy souvenirs. Some of the men visited a notorious brothel called the Wazza and came back with all sorts of diseases, but apparently Lancer was a more diffident youth, interested in mechanical things, and he happened to pass in the streets of Cairo a shop front run by an Armenian named Mekian. And Mekian was running a small recording studio, mostly recording ethnic music of Egypt at the time. Lancer looked through the window, saw all of this going on, and wondered if he could have his voice recorded on disc, 78 RPM disc, mechanically recorded, to send back to his parents in Australia. Meckian named a price. It was a fairly high price by the standards of today. But Lancer agreed to it and just on spec strolled into the shop, put down his money. I think it was in the order of £1 or something. It was quite a large amount of money by the standards of those time for 3 minutes of recorded audio, and not very good recorded audio. But he stood up to the recording trumpet, as it was in those days, did a little impromptu talk, lots of stutters, lots of pauses, of course, as any person who'd never been recorded before would do, but send messages of best wishes to his parents. Quite touching in its own way. A couple of weeks later, he was told by Mr. Meckian that they'd made up a stamper. They'd stamped out some shellac copies and forwarded them to his parents, who duly got them. And I'll tell you what happened to Henry Miller Lancer after I play the record. This is now in the hands of the Australian War Memorial, and quite a historical recording in its own way. Henry Miller Lancer recorded in Cairo, introduced by the recording engineer Meckian in February 1915. That's 106 years ago.
Mission record. Well, dear mother and father, Ethel, Edie, and Basil. This is rather a novelty to come to Australia this way, but here I am, can't see and can't be seen, or welcomed in the usual way with a hug and a kiss. I can't speak long with you this trip. Tell Jim Seymour to come in so that I can wish him all of his family the compliments of the season. Jim, I wish you the compliments of the season with any amount of good luck. My thoughts are very often on a friend in Robinson Street. Well, Father, I was pleased to get that souvenir of the Australians who volunteered to keep the flag flying, and we're going to do it. The past week, training is getting heavier every day. My words, the Germans or Turks, as we hear, they are making for Egypt. Whatever happens, we'll stop them from laughing anyhow. When we do start. I don't know that I can say a great deal more now, Mother, as this is a time-limited sort of affair. But all I can wish is that I hope you all had a real jolly good Christmas. We did, I know. And of course it was rather not the really first time I've been away from Christmas, but I was very anxious to get back to this one. But here I am here now. I'm really enjoying myself, and that's the main thing, and I hope everyone at home are doing the same thing. So, 1 minute. Ethel, when is Ethel going to do this 24 hours again? I wish I could go and we could go to the theatre together, something like that. But I can't. You see, I can't leave this instrument. I can't jump out of it. So I think I'll have to close now and wish you goodbye for the time being, anyhow. Well, goodbye, everybody, and good luck.
And that's all there is to it, really. Henry Miller Lancer, then a sergeant with the 1st AIF in Cairo during his training for Gallipoli. Well, he went to Gallipoli with the rest of the invasion force on Anzac Day in 1915, the first Anzac Day, 25th of April. He was wounded 4 days later, wounded again later in the year. Chest wound, could have been a lot worse. But you can imagine the sort of conditions that he was facing at the age of 24. Was invalided out for a little while to a hospital ship, then redeployed at Bapaume on the Western Front in France in 1916. Acted as a trainer for machine guns at that stage, and then finally was returned to duty, and 2 days after returning to duty, he copped it. Killed in action, 5th of November 1916. A tragic story, terrible last 2 years of his life. And all his parents had of him, really, was that record and a few keepsakes that were sent back. Of his list is actually in his First World War service record. I looked it up this afternoon. Very sad story. But what you'll notice about that record is, particularly if you're my age or maybe a little older, if you listen to the First World War veterans who were still around in the 1960s, then in their 70s and 80s, they spoke very much like that. But 24-year-olds in the 60s didn't speak like that. What we're listening to is a late 19th century Australian accent. There are many changes that have occurred in that accent in the last 100 years, and only in the last 40 or so have there been any real study of the Australian accent or how it's changed. When I was first involved with broadcasting in the 1970s, a broad Australian accent was seen as an undesirable thing. Not anymore. Fortunately, that sort of post-colonial snobbery seems to have disappeared. And we no longer have people like John Royal and Corinne Kirby on television. If you're old enough to remember them, you're at least my age. Anyway, there was a time in my life back in 1978 when I was 24. One of my first jobs for a university was for Macquarie University in Sydney. A lady named Carolyn Craig came to the National Library while I was also researching there in the film section, and she was working for Professor of Linguistics. Arthur Delbridge was his name, Professor Arthur Delbridge. And they asked me, as a person who had a good working knowledge of early Australian recordings and films, particularly early sound films, if I would assist them in finding examples of early Australian speech on disc, on cylinder, and on film soundtracks. So they hired me. The project was called Australians at Talk. It was an offshoot of work on what became the Macquarie Dictionary, which you may have heard of. And the release that particularly I was involved with was a 3-cassette release in a sort of a bound volume. I should have brought it on camera for those who have YouTube Live, in which we reproduced a lot of recordings of Australians talking. The earliest example, I think, at that stage was about 1926. But Macquarie University, as a result of that pioneering work by Arthur Delbridge, the late Arthur Delbridge now, 43 years later, is the work of the lecturer I'm about to play you a lecture by. And that's Associate Professor Felicity Cox of Macquarie Uni. She studies two things, etymology and phonology. Etymology is the study of changes in words and the meanings of words. Phonology is the study of the changes of speech sounds. And both of those apply to the changes of the Australian accent over the last, well, even the last 20 years with immigration being what it is and the change of the national constituents of the Australian population changing accordingly. So, let's have a listen to a lecture by Professor Felicity Cox about changes in the Australian accent. This was recorded at Melbourne Uni in 2016, with many recorded examples being played, and unfortunately, while they recorded Felicity very nicely, the recorded examples were recorded by Felicity's throat microphone, so consequently they're a little indistinct. Perhaps I shouldn't say what I think of the level of technology in this university recording, but sometimes private recording people can do better. Anyway, the Australian accent and changes in it as studied by Professor Felicity Cox, visiting Melbourne from Macquarie University in 2016.
So we're going to talk about the origins and the evolution of Australian English. It was a little bit hard for me to know how to pitch this talk, given that it's a public lecture. So there are people in the room who are phoneticians like me, who know a lot about speech sounds and how we produce them and how we can analyse them and the kinds of research we can do. But there are also people in the room who don't really know anything about those things. So you're here to learn. So I've got a bit of a show and tell for you. I've got lots of pictures, I've got lots of sound files, and hopefully everybody will gain something from this talk today. Oh, not turned on. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge my colleague Sally-Ann Palethorpe, who has worked with me for over 20 years on our Australian accent work. Sally-Ann's been unwell, so she's unable to attend lots of conferences, but she's there in spirit all the time. And also I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues at Macquarie University in the Phonetics Lab and the Child Language Lab as well. This is a slide that I like to start my presentations with because it seems to me that it illustrates the range of different kinds of people who speak with an Australian English accent, who have Australian English as their dialect. People from all walks of life, from different genders, different ages, different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds, and so on. So what is this thing that we call Australian English? Well, we know that it's a regional dialect of English because it's spoken in Australia. When we talk about a dialect, what we're talking about is a variety that has a distinctive phonology, that's the sound system, distinctive grammar, and distinctive vocabulary. Australian English is that variety that's spoken by people who were born and or raised in Australia. Now, the operational definition that we use for this when we're doing research is that people who have had all of their primary and secondary schooling in Australia. So it's people who are raised here. Of course, there are also people who have come to Australia after the age of their primary school years who still speak with an Australian English accent. The time of migration and whether a person will develop an Australian English accent is quite fluid, but this is the definition that we use. It's certainly the definition that was used in the Oztalk corpus, which is a corpus of 1,000 individuals from around Australia. This is the form, Australian English is a form that is the standard now in Australia. This term, endonormative stabilisation, basically just means that it's a codified form. It's the form that Australians use as their standard, as opposed to an exonormative form, which would have been British English, that would have been the standard in the early part of the 20th century. Australian English is a multicultural dialect. It is spoken by the majority of the population, but Australia is, as we know, a multicultural community. There, according to the not the most recent census, I don't think we'll know very much about the most recent census, but the previous census, 71.8% of people were born in Australia, 28.2% were born overseas, and this is the highest number of overseas born in the population for over 100 years. So this is quite an extraordinary feat. At least, so we've got a large proportion of the population have shared national identities. Australians come from over 200 countries and over 300 languages are spoken in the community. Having said that though, Australia is very Anglo-centric. 81% of the population speak only English at home. So English is the dominant variety, of course. Australia is a land of extremes. You might think, what's this got to do with language? But actually it's quite important. It's the least densely populated inhabited continent, and it contains some of the most remote communities. Only 16% of the population live in these rural and remote communities. Most live in the cities. And so on the one hand, it's the least densely populated. On the other hand, it's the most urbanized communities. So what does this mean? Well, it has implications for exposure to diversity, because exposure to diversity can lead to variation and therefore can lead to sound change. The diversity in the community is extreme. So we have in the capital cities a lot of overseas born people. For example, in Harris Park in Sydney, 76% of the community were born overseas. Whereas in rural areas, there's far less diversity. And in Temora, for example, a community in New South Wales, only 9% of the community is overseas born. So what this means is that there is variation in the exposure to linguistic diversity, and in some new research that we're about to undertake, we're going to be looking at variation in the communities to see how this has an effect on how children develop language and whether sound change is different in different communities according to diversity. So what is it that we know about Australian English? Some of you who have done some linguistics in the past will know that in the past we used to describe Australian English as a variety that had variation in three different categories. People spoke with a broad Australian English accent, with a general Australian English accent, or with a cultivated English accent. That's how we described variation. Of course, this type of categorisation neglected to talk about Indigenous varieties of English, and neglected to talk about ethnocultural varieties of English. It only spoke about standard or mainstream Australian English. So what we have to remember when we're thinking about Australian English is that it encompasses a whole range, all members of the community. It encompasses members from the Indigenous groups, from ethnocultural groups, and also from the standard Australian English mainstream group. Now, the ethnocultural and the Indigenous varieties have been poorly described. Some of you in the room might take exception to me saying that, but certainly the ethnocultural varieties have not been well described. There are very few studies looking at how ethnicity affects Australian English. So there's a challenge. We need to do this work. And of course, also the Australian Aboriginal varieties need to be described as well. I know Debbie's working on a project at the moment, and I'm sure there are various other people in the room working on Indigenous varieties of Australian Aboriginal English. But the other thing to remember is that people can be multi-dialectal. So there are potentially people who use all three of these types, but certainly bidialectalism would be common. So what I'm going to talk about today is accent, and I'm not going to be talking about Aboriginal English varieties or ethnocultural English varieties. I'm just going to be talking about mainstream Australian English, because that has been the focus of our work, although we have branched out into some other areas as well. We will be focusing today on standard or mainstream Australian English. See my picture of Paul Hogan there, who of course has a kind of a quintessential broad Australian accent. The accent relates to the phonological aspects of the dialect or the sound system. We know that accent is a powerful symbol for the expression of identity. It's interesting, I recently come across, because I'm interested in how children develop accents, and I've recently come across this work that shows that children select friends from same accent groups regardless of race over same race groups. I think this is quite extraordinary, because it speaks to this idea that children develop the language of their peers. They make an effort to speak like their peers. And so, of course, if you want to be part of the group, then you will try to conform to group norms. So how does mainstream Australian English differ from other Englishes? Well, this is a talk in itself. This is a whole talk. This is actually a course. So I'm not going to talk about it in any detail, but I want to give you some examples. We can think about it in terms of inventory. So Australian English has lots of vowels. It has a very rich vowel inventory. And so the work that I've been doing mainly does relate to vowels. Funnily, when I completed my PhD, went out to dinner with my friends. This was a long time ago, and they said to me, "How could you possibly write that much on A, E, I, O, and U?" Not being phoneticians, of course, they didn't realise that in fact there are at least 18 vowels in Australian English. So there are inventory differences between the different varieties of English. The phonetic realisation varies. So my neighbour who's a French speaker, said to me one day, "Oh, I didn't realise that suburb in Sydney, Beacon Hill, was actually Beacon. She always thought it was Bacon Hill." So there are phonetic realisation differences. Phonotactics is also important. Phonotactics refers to how sounds can combine in words, where they can occur in words. Allophonic processes, reduction processes, and connected speech processes. Now, one of the things I will be talking about today is this phenomenon called linking R or intrusive R. So if I say to you this person's name, I can say it like this, Tina Arena, or it could be pronounced like this.
Tina Arena.
Okay, so it's Tina Arena. He's using this phenomenon, this connected speech process, the intrusive R, and it's very, very common in Australian English, but I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. You may have seen this. So in 2010, John Fain, the Melbourne radio announcer, radio journalist, accused Julia Gillard of referring to Tony Abbott as Mr. Rabbit intentionally. I think that probably his producer didn't speak with an Australian English accent because Julia Gillard was a bit taken aback because she didn't realise that she had done anything unusual. Mr. Rabbit. Mr. Rabbit, Mr. Rabbit. She was using a linking R, which is very common in Australian English. So what happens, what happens is when you've got a word that ends in a vowel sound like Mr., right? And another word that starts with a vowel sound like Abbott. These are two vowels, and languages don't like to put two vowels together. So what people do, what languages do, is insert consonants. And one of the consonants that can be inserted is an sound, and it depends on the characteristics of the vowels as to which consonant is inserted. But in this case, it was an So this is a common connected speech process in Australian English. There are lexical effects which I won't talk about. Voice quality, I love this voice. I'll just play it for you now.
As you know, the price of opals these days is very high.
Now that guy, that sound file comes from the Mitchell and Delbridge corpus. Now some of you will know Mitchell and Delbridge were researchers in the 1960s, and they conducted a survey where they collected more than 7,000 voices from all around the country. And here's one of those, and I'll play a few more of them later on as well. The final example here is an example of prosody, and this is an example of the high-rising tune or uptalk.
This wooden pole.
Okay, so that's from the map task, one of the map tasks. So those are just some examples of the sorts of things that we find in Australian English that differ from other varieties. Now, of course, it's not just one of those things. It's the constellation of these co-occurring characteristics that gives the accent its characteristic Australianness. So what do we know? What do we believe? How do we believe that Australian English developed? Well, we believe that it derived from the early settlers in the penal colony in 1788. And these people came mainly from the southeast of England, although they did come from all over England, but mainly from the southeast. It's difficult to work out exactly where they came from because their place of trial was recorded, but not their place of birth or their place of upbringing. They arrived to this place that was incredibly rich in the cultural and linguistic diversity of the first people. There was an estimated more than 200 languages, Australian languages spoken here by an estimated population of more than 300,000 people. Of course, the European settlement had devastating consequences for the Aboriginal people, and today fewer than 10 Australian languages survive. And of course, there are people in the room here who know a lot more about this than me and are working very hard to regenerate and describe and bring to the fore these languages. So how did this early Australian English develop? It's against that backdrop of the languages that were already here in Australia, that we now find a new language developing. The early Australian English language, developed very early, and it developed in the speech of the non-Indigenous Australian-born children through a process that is referred to as new dialect formation. We know that there was an identifiable form of Australian English present in the community very early. So we have quotes from Dixon, from Bennett, very early on, talking about the children and the kind of language they were using. And the comments were positive, primarily positive, right up until about the 1880s, even later. There were very positive comments, and I've got some examples here. So James Dixon, 1822, talking about the children who speak with a better language, pure, harmonious language. George Bennett also talks about the purity of the language of the children. And James Froude, the same, talks about this purity. Now, what they mean by that, really, we think, is that the children spoke with a homogeneous type of accent, homogeneous language, compared to in Britain, where there were lots and lots and lots of, there was a lot of variety, lots of different accents. So they're talking about this singular variety spoken by the children. So how can this happen? Well, the process of new dialect formation that's been described by Peter Trudgill is that it occurs as a result of contact between mutually intelligible dialects of a single language in what he refers to as tabula rasa context. Now, tabula rasa in this context means that there was no existing variety of English in the community or in any surrounding communities. He describes 3 stages in the process: the contact variability, and the focusing. The contact, of course, is when people come together, they all speak lots of different varieties, they start to accommodate to each other, they start to, in a small way, accommodate in terms of their speech production.
Just interrupting there, this is VK3AML with the usual Saturday night test transmissions. And we're playing a lecture by Associate Professor Felicity Cox of Macquarie University, recorded in 2016, on the development of Australian accent, which is traceable from the 19th century in largely textual records, but from the 1890s onwards, of course, there are recordings of Australians talking. And she'll get into that in a few minutes' time. Professor Cox was recorded at a summer school of Melbourne University in 2016. So back to the lecture on the development of the Australian accent.
The new dialect is different from all of the different other varieties, but there are different weightings of the components in the new dialect. The children were pivotal in this. And Colin Yallop describes the children as being the first speakers of Australian English. We know that children rapidly accommodate to their peers. There's this drive for social conformity, as I mentioned before. Children speak like their friends. One of my sons, when he was in preschool, he was about 4, came home one day with an American English accent. His friend, a new child had arrived who spoke with an American English accent. Over the course of a week or so, my son stopped speaking with an American English accent, and so did the boy. They were in an Australian English-speaking community. Children's social identities are in flux, of course, neuroplasticity and so on. They're very vulnerable to linguistic change and learning. So the children were the speakers of the new variety. How could this new variety develop so quickly? It's difficult to estimate exactly how many children there were, but Philip's records suggest there were 41 children arrived with the first fleet, 41 children under the age of 12. There was incredible natural increase in the population of children in the first 20 years, in the first 20 years, approximately 25% were children. So there were lots of children. There was extensive opportunities for them to talk to each other, to develop social networks. There were schools. Lots of children were sent to orphanages, even though they weren't orphans. They were taken off the streets and put into these community buildings where they were taught skills, apparently to save them from the depravity of the community, of the colony, but probably to teach them skills so that they could become servants. Trudgill talks about the inevitability of new dialect formation, that if you know what elements will be in the community, then you'll be able to work out what the new dialect will sound like. So his thesis is that if I took a group of people and sent them all to a colony on Mars or wherever, the children, when they started talking, they would all combine the different dialects in the community in various proportions, and we would be able to predict what that dialect would sound like. We know that this is a result of convergence or accommodation. Why is it that Australian English is relatively homogeneous? What I mean by that is that around the country, it's very difficult to tell where somebody comes from. There are small markers, phonological markers, to indicate regional variation, but not very many. So a person can be from Perth, from Brisbane, from Adelaide, and I may not be able to tell them apart unless they use one of the specific markers, and there are a few of those. So why is there regional uniformity? Maybe, according to Peter Trudgill, the reason is that in each of the centres there was the same dialect mix that created the new variety. Others would argue that the dialect began in Sydney and was transported from Sydney to the other centres. We don't know the answer as to which of those is the actual explanation, but there was a lot of internal migration which would have contributed to homogeneity. After the gold rushes, there was large-scale migration from Britain, and this led to a heightened sense of national identity and also acknowledgement of difference from Britain, because by then, this was more than 50 years after settlement, the accents had started to change. The accents in Britain had changed, and in Australia had changed, and so they were diverging. So when people started coming to Australia from Britain in large numbers, they used a new dialect. And a lot of them came with the idea that RP, received pronunciation, was the quintessential English variety that everybody should aspire to. And so comments started to become common about how degraded Australian English was, how it was not good enough, how it was the variety of convicts, the lower classes. And this was because RP was considered to be the norm and the standard. This is probably the reason why we ended up with a continuum of variation from the broad to the cultivated. At this time, people aspired to RP and started using an Australian English production that was more towards a cultivated type. And the opposite occurred as well, a reaction against that. So then we have the three varieties. Well, it's really a continuum of variation from the very local forms to the more British type forms, and these divisions deepened around World War I. So what do they sound like? Here we have some examples from the Mitchell and Delbridge corpus again. This first girl, 15-year-old, is using a cultivated type of accent.
Beach, root, say, so high, how.
And the other one, I knew I should have separated them. She's using a more broad type of accent. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a shift away from the extremities of this continuum, and more people started using a general type of accent. But new variation developed. So it was no longer possible to describe variation using these categories, broad, general, and cultivated. So why am I interested in sound change? Well, sound change helps us understand how linguistic systems work, how the various elements interact in the system. So one of the interesting aspects that one of the interesting aspects that I work on is vowel shift, how different vowels affect each other in change.
This is VK3AML. You're listening there to a lecture by Professor Felicity Cox talking about the changes in Australian accent. She goes on to talk about how the harmonics of various vowel sounds have changed by analysing them on waterfall displays. And of course we can't show you that at the moment because I cannot insert videos into this stream on YouTube Live. I'm looking into OBS, which has been suggested by a few of the viewers here, but have not yet implemented that. So you're listening to VK3AML on 147.475, and if anybody wants to look in as well as listening or get better audio quality, try our YouTube live stream. You'll find that by Googling VK3AML live as a phrase in Google search, or going straight to YouTube on that basis. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, VK3AML live, LIVE, 2 words. There is in Britain an even richer source of early recordings of local accent accessible to them, which was created under the most extraordinary circumstances during the First World War. A German team of linguists was interested to investigate the British accent and its regional variations, even while the First World War was raging. So what did they do? They conscripted prisoners of war from German prison of war camps during World War I and recorded them systematically. There are over 878 RPM discs in this series, but the series was described in a BBC radio program, and I'll play you a bit of that.
Our understanding of Edwardian Britain is dominated by images. We can see it in flickering footage of the time, in formal family portraits. But apart from a few famous voices, the people themselves remain silent. We can see the Edwardians, but we can't hear them. But there has been a remarkable discovery which for the first time gives voice to our ancestors, and it has come from the most unlikely place, Germany.
We had a man that had 2 sons.
Hundreds of recordings have come to light which reveal the voices of British prisoners from the First World War.
Home far away, no one to welcome me home, but when I returned towards Ireland again, further, I'll sin against Devon and again yo. I know
I'm going to return to the hometowns of these men and meet their families. How does it feel to hear one of your relatives speaking to you from nearly a century ago? And how much have all our voices changed since Edwardian times? What do you think the placement of a Geordie accent is? Where it's formed in the mouth, what the mouth shape's like?
Well, to be honest, I wouldn't know. The thing that strikes me about a Geordie accent is the tune of it, that it goes up at the end of the sentences. I have to say, for someone like me, Geordie is probably the most difficult accent.
I have an unusual job. I teach accents for a living. I teach accents to actors for theatre, television, films. In the time I've been teaching, I've taught over 350 accents. It can end on an up, it can end on a down, it can end wherever you like. But it's got to have that direction about going over the wave of the North Sea in order to get there.
Right.
To do with that. And I think, too, that there's much more variety of tune in a Newcastle accent, don't you, than in most other accents. I mean, you get a thing that a lot of the lads just like speaking really low down, but there are a huge number of the women that actually can move about an octave within a sentence. Try saying to me, Jim caught This is a long one to remember. Jim caught 6 fish with a stick at the weekend. Keep going over the top.
At the weekend.
Exactly. So you've got that glottal going with a K. At the
Weekend.
weekend with Jockey.
Right.
And that helps you enormously, doesn't
Jackie.
it? Yes. Okay.
Jim caught 6 fish at the weekend with Jackie.
Good. The British Isles has a rich tapestry of different accents. Over the years, I've come to feel connections between the way we speak and the scenery that surrounds us. It seems to me that landscape dictates or has something to do with the tune of an accent. It certainly feels true that the flatter a landscape, the flatter the accent. The area of East Anglia being a perfect example, which is probably the flattest county geographically and has the flattest accent. So there's a feeling like in East Anglia, you take a few steps forward, little step back, another little step forward, and it stays very much on like 2 or 3 notes, which could contrast very clearly with somewhere like South Wales. The hills and valleys where we're travelling from the valley over the top of the hillside onto the other side. And so there's a feeling of expansiveness. One of the most interesting factors in accents to me is whether the tune is in major or minor key. Good examples of that, to make that clear, would be Birmingham, which is absolutely in minor key, so I could go on and on, end where I like, but never ever end on a definite note. So you hear that sort of dull minor key ending, as opposed to something like North Yorkshire, where I'm ending on very, very much on definite notes, and I'm bound to sound more sure of myself. A career of listening to voices has taught me how quickly accent and dialect, the particular words local to each region, change over time. To find out how people used to speak in the past, I'm dependent on old recordings, and the further back I go, the fewer there are. Sound recording was in its infancy in the Edwardian era, and so was reserved for the great and the good. This is what makes the discovery of recordings of ordinary soldiers from World War I so remarkable. I've come to Berlin to find out more about these recordings of British prisoners of war. Just 4 years ago, author John Adams came across them by chance while researching local dialect.
I first came across these recordings through a book in the British Library. This book was called Cheshire Muntart, Cheshire Dialect. It was published in 1938, and it referred back to recordings made of prisoners of war during the First World War. These recordings were said to be in Berlin, so I wrote to the Humboldt University and asked them if the recordings still existed. I got a marvellous reply back. If I told them what I wanted, they would send them to me. So I phoned up the British Library Sound Archive and said, were they aware that these recordings existed? And they said no. And if they did exist, they were of national importance.
Miraculously, these fragile records, made from a brittle resin called shellac, survived the devastation of Berlin during the Second World War and are still there today. Hidden away in a corner of the city stands the archive which holds the recordings, overseen by sound and music expert Jürgen Marenholz. He has dedicated the last 8 years to a meticulous process of cataloguing and filing. How many First World War recordings do you have here?
Oh, we have 1,650 shellac recordings.
Oh, wow.
Here in our archive.
And how many British prisoners of war does that include?
I think we have 200 recordings on shellac discs.
So if I said a county to you, you could just pick something out of the cabinet?
Yes, for example, we have...
if I said Dorset?
Yes, Dorset, for example. The code number is 467. Yes.
So this is it. This is the first one I see. So this is a recording of Dorset. What does that say?
It's also south of Dorset.
Right. And the recording is of, written in handwriting, the recording is of the farmer's daughter. Farmer's daughter, is that right?
Yes, it's right. And the code number is PK467.
The recordings were masterminded by two men. Alois Brandl was an Austrian academic fascinated by British accents and dialects, whose research trips to this country had been brought to an abrupt end by the outbreak of war. Wilhelm Durgan was a sound specialist, whose dream was to create a museum of languages and music from around the world. In the first few months of the war, several thousand British soldiers were captured and taken prisoner in Germany. They were held in dozens of camps stretching across the country. As the war raged, Durgan realized that on his doorstep was a captive resource. These camps offered him a unique opportunity to record the speech and music of many different nationalities. Seizing his chance, Durgan put forward his plan to make recordings of the prisoners to the German authorities.
The Germans would have been very keen to exploit the resource of all these prisoners of different nationalities who had effectively landed on their doorstep. They would have had access to a huge range of ethnic groups, of languages, and of cultural traditions, which would have made it very interesting for ethnographers, musical historians, linguists.
Permission was granted. Between 1915 and 1918, Brandl and Durgan formed part of a team of academics who toured over 70 prisoner of war camps, recording around 250 languages and dialects. For Brandl, this was the perfect opportunity to study his favourite subject, British accents and dialects. For the prisoners of war, however, life in the camps was harsh.
The physical surroundings of camps varied greatly. For the ordinary soldiers, they were often not unlike in perhaps some of the camps that they'd experienced at home in the British Army, but they were often of a far inferior standard, usually hutted accommodation, possibly with up to 20 or 30 men in each hut. They'd be very, very cold in the winter, and German winters can be extremely cold, and these men didn't have access to warm winter clothing in many cases, or they'd lost their warm winter clothing during their capture. So they would be wired in, there would be sentries, and in some cases there would also be dogs patrolling the outer perimeter. So it was an extremely oppressive and very unpleasant place to be incarcerated.
For 3 years, Brandl and Durgan devoted all their time to this ambitious project. Travelling from camp to camp, they recorded one prisoner after another, building up a vast archive of voices and keeping detailed written records of each speaker. It's fantastic to see this at last, and I really can't wait to hear it. Can you play it for me?
Oh yes, I can do. That's a recording of Sidney Wilkins.
But how can you know the speed at which to play it?
The last groove here has an A,
Yeah.
and I can control this A with our tune fork here. And when the speed of the recording is right, I have the same tune from this record. And
Right.
Now the...
So now you're adjusting the speed down here.
Yes, there's the pitch control.
Right.
And now you hear it's the same tune,
Yes.
and now the record is ready for...
So can we hear Sydney?
Yes, now we can hear the real voice.
Is all the farmer's daughters, the beautiful I'm told, whose parents died and left her 500 pounds in gold. Her uncle kept the ploughboy, who Mary loved so well, and in her uncle's garden the tales of love would tell. There were a wealthy squire who oft came her to see, but still she loved her ploughboy on the bank of the sweet Dundee.
What do you think about this recording?
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, I don't know what Sydney would think about us listening to this now.
Yes.
If I listen to his recording, I mean, if I do it from my clinical, more scientific side, if I listen to that recording and you asked me where he came from in England, I don't think I would guess Dorset. I thought I would guess somewhere deeper into the West Country, because he sounds almost like Somerset nowadays.
Have I got open mic here? Can you hear me?
Like Zummer and Varmer, these F's to V's and S to Z's really belong deeper into the West Country.
This is our number, VK108.
The text most frequently recorded was the parable of the prodigal son, but the prisoners also recited poems, told local stories, and sang songs.
Can you hear me speaking now? If you can, just... That's odd.
What do you think about that?
I put the mic on.
Very emotional. Very emotional, because it's
live now.
It's a very typical
But
Scottish
it's
song,
not
and
live
about-
now,
the
unless you can
song's
still
about
hear me
love.
on the YouTube stream.
And, it just touches me about longing for home. You just hear the yearning in the voice. And it sounds exactly, the accent sounds exactly as you'd hear someone from that area now. The recordings had an educational purpose, to document for the German nation the speech and music of the rest of the
Hello, hello, hello.
But was there a greater plan in mind? How did they get the finances? Because particularly at that time, during the war,
Yes.
there wasn't a lot of spare money around, presumably.
Yes, the first 2 years are spent by the German government.
Really?
Yes, because this was a colonial area of Germany too, and they thought
It should be off now, unless you can hear it now.
that they
Still
that
live.
they do not lost this World War.
Oh, so they thought that they were going to come to all these places and pass themselves off as native speakers of Dorset. So this is the devious plan. Is this?
When they have the good recordings, they can train all the people who go to the new colonies.
Do you surmise that? Do you guess that, or do you know that?
I know that because it was the purpose of Wilhelm Dögen, and that is written down in some readings, that this was also to train, well, these recordings were also made to train the person who go to the
colonies.
Interesting that my mic is, well, I put the mic back on for both, but it's coming out of the same peak limiter that my transmissions are coming off. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima on YouTube Live, as well as unless the stream's coming off the webcam, in which case the audio quality you'd get on YouTube would not be good. So if anybody wants to look in on this, you can look in on YouTube Live under VK3AML Live as a search term. What I thought I'd do as a bit of fun now is to talk about the regional Australian accents and have a translation segment. We now introduce the segment English to CB, the translation thereof. Some suitable music. English to CB. Okay, let's have some translations of typical CB radio terms. For example, let's start with a reasonable one. If I wanted to say you need to adjust your audio level on NBFM, on CB you would say this.
Oh, you need to adjust the deviation in that shit.
Yeah, okay. So you get the idea. Now, taking it further, let's translate from English to CB radio talk. The term, I'm enjoying this refreshment, it's superior to coffee. On CB, it would be spoken like this.
Tell you what, these fucking beers are going down beautiful. Where are you, Gunner? You're on the side of the town, you had a cup of coffee or something, are you?
You get the picture. This is English to CB translations. Let's translate the phrase, I'm in a poor position for transmitting. I'm in a poor position for transmitting. Translated into CB.
I'm not going to race today, you must be in dead spot.
The term, please reply to my radio call. Please reply to my radio call. In CB.
Where are you, Gunner? You're going clean. You're on quiet, have you? I know you're listening to anti-radio. Oh, no, everything's gone quiet on this repeater there, over. The more you say.
I think I could tell him why it was. Now, translating from English to CB again, what is the current status of your employment and are you enjoying it, as spoken in CB language?
Yes, I want to be old to me. I'm not that old. I'm 4-week-old boys. You get up this hour, you going to work, are you? That's good on you then. Work is healthy though, that's the fun thing about it. You want to know, do it yourself. As long as you enjoy yourself, that's the main thing. You're living in a good spot, that's what you want.
Oh boy. Now, the next English phrase to be translated. Let me tell you about this new radio club. It's an interesting club, this one.
Yeah, no, I went to AA, no, it's just no good. I'm a lost unit. Well, you don't know me very well, man. Obviously, you don't know me very well at all. Well, that's your privilege, mate. It's got to do with the matter anyway, mate, you know? Have a bit of decorum. Well, if you want to get in, well, it's up to you, mate. You know? If you want to be a man, you stick around. If you don't want to be a man, well, do it. Yeah, that's right, mate. Been there, done that. Don't want to know about it anymore. I've been through the suicide shit now before, mate, you know? And to be quite honest, there's some of the people that I hear one in every crowd.
It does require translation, doesn't it? Now, the English phrase, I have just had a good meal. I have just had a good meal, as spoken on CB. God, I hope the radio inspectors aren't listening. Had a good meal last night, translated into CB. On the contrary, I had a bad meal. You can even hear the lumpy bits. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the presentation English into CB radio. And these are actual recordings. That's the extraordinary thing. This is not a put on. These are actual recordings made by friends of mine over the last 4 or 5 weeks. I could be very, very crude, and I think I probably have lowered the tone of the channel quite considerably over the last 5 minutes. But that level of crudity has existed in one way or another for a very, very long time. Some of you may have heard of a French performer at the turn of last century, during the 1890s particularly. He was well known to Toulouse-Lautrec in France. And his stage name was Le Pétomane. Le Pétomane, P-E-T-O-M-A-N-E. Le Pétomane's claim to fame was that he could fart the Marseillaise. He actually could breathe with it, and he performed with it on stage. Now, I always thought that this was an old wives' tale, a community legend, a myth. And then a 7-inch disc made in 1904 in Paris turned up in a friend's collection abroad, done not by Le Pétomane, but by one of his imitators, Monsieur Lefires, L-E-F-I-R-E-S. And I hope some of you can understand French. I will translate bits of this as I can. But this is a spoken introduction of a farting performer recorded in 1904 with piano accompaniment.
Silence sous le Pétomane Le Tirette. Nous laissons la parole sans odeur au maestro Le Tirette, après vous avoir fait entendre un motif de la célèbre valse La Soissonnaise.
Piano.
Ben voilà.
Watch.
Nous allons commencer par le fait de la femme à son retour d'âge. Le fait de ma belle-mère. Le fait de mon son.
My aunt.
Le même sec étant manqué.
That's his late father being
Le
imitated.
même sur une chaise percée après l'absorption d'une bouteille d'eau hongroise. Les douze sangs lors de sa visite au roi des bêtes. Derrière.
Behind.
Devant.
In front.
Fait d'une personne constipée. Fait d'un cheval au trot.
This is a soldier on
Fait d'un
parade.
cheval au galop. Fait de l'éléphant en mal d'enfant. Fait de la girafe en train de se monter le cou.
That was the finale.
Voilà.
Not a particularly... Oh, shut up. Not a particularly good imitator of the original Pétomane who could fart the Marseillaise, but nevertheless it indicates that it actually was a real thing on stage. And he even had imitators. That was recorded on an Odeon 7-inch disc in France, in Paris, February 1904. Dear, oh dear, oh dear. Royser, you swear you've heard the guy on that repeater. That is exactly where he has come from, and only recently, Royser. What now? Well, I could talk about the Australian examples of Australian speech going way back that have been recorded. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. I have to keep on announcing that because we are on air as well as on YouTube Live. Anybody like to look in? We're on VK3AML Live. If you feed that phrase VK3AML LIVE, live, 2 words, VK3AML Live, into Google search, you'll find me on YouTube Live. At the moment, still using the same program as last week. We haven't yet worked out how to use OBS and insert stills and video inserts, so we're a little bit hobbled in what we can present. As an example of the Australian accent, which was very much closer to the British accent back 100 or more years ago, one of the earliest examples that I have is of 2 Australian performers, Peter Dawson, well-known Australian baritone born in 1880, who was in the first decade of the 20th century making his first records, and another performer even older, born in 1870, Albert Whelan. Albert Whelan was born in Western Australia and made his stage debut in the 1880s on the Kalgoorlie, or the West Australian goldfields. Peter Dawson made his debut in Adelaide. They both went to England, did well on the music halls, and were in good demand with the new disc recording companies in the first decade of the 20th century. In 1907, Albert Whelan and Peter Dawson, both from Australia, made a little vaudeville record for the Christmas market in 1907 called A Jolly Christmas. It was sort of a radio play before the days of radio, if you will see what I mean. Peter Dawson and Albert Whelan. Listen for the accents. They are actually Australian accents, but not Australian accents as we now know it.
Well, boys and girls, enough of dancing for a while. Let us come and sit round the fire and tell stories.
Good idea. Say, Squire, never mind about the stories. Sing us a song.
Nay, my boy, I'm getting too old for a song now. Yes, I am. But I'll call on the young squire, my son, to sing a song with a chorus, in which I hope you will all join. Now then, Jack, my boy, sing us a verse of that good old song, The Mighty Roast Beef of Old England.
That's right you are, Dad. Here goes. For when mighty roast beef was the Englishman's food, it ennobled our hearts and enriched our blood. Our soldiers were brave and our conscience were good. Oh, the roast beef of old England, and all for old England's roast beef. Oh, the roast beef of old England, and all for old England's roast beef.
Good old song, and well sung too. But listen, my friend, I can hear the carols sing. Let us open the door and listen a while. On the cold winter night that walks so deep, nowhere, 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 what is the King of Israel? My friends, I've enjoyed your beautiful singing so much that I would like you to come inside and have a glass of wine with me. So now, gentlemen, I drink to your health and wish you all a Merry Christmas.
Gentlemen, the Squire, and a Merry Christmas to all his friends.
That was recorded in 1907, one of the earliest examples of recordings of the Australian accent, with Albert Whelan from Western Australia and Peter Dawson, brought up in Adelaide, performing in Britain on a very early Zonophone recording. Sounds like one of the characters in the Goon Show. It could be very close, but much further back. What was 114 years ago, that. Another performer who was from even closer quarters, Billy Williams, one of the first recording stars, certainly the first recording star produced by Australia, was born in Collingwood in 1877 and went to Britain with Florrie Ford, another musical star who got him work on the halls. In 1906, Billy Williams from Collingwood started making records on cylinders for Thomas Edison through the Edison London studio. And by 1910, when this next recording was cut, Please Listen for the Australian accent from the old Collingwood boy, Billy Williams had risen to worldwide fame. This is recorded on the 18th of February 1910, and it's getting back about as far as we can take the Australian accent on record. Oh.
On the shores of Hobson's Bay, I was strolling along one day. When I reached Kilda, there I met Matilda. She's a dainty parasol, she was walking by the sea. Oh, I thought I was wise, but her goo-goo eyes, they fair goo-googled me. For I met her at St. Kilda, my beautiful Matilda. My love got so very, very hot. Oh, it absolutely grilled her. The boys shouted in St. Kilda, oh, Bill, have mercy on Matilda. But when her husband came along with 6 big kids, oh, I felt I could have killed her. Serves her right, too. And a jolly well serves her right. When I found that I'd been had, my Victorian plum was bad. I thought that she was well born, as she came from Melbourne. Here's the wedding ring I bought for her finger just for spite. Oh, I'll never get wed, I will pawn it instead, and I won't go home tonight. For I met her at St. Kilda, my beautiful Matilda. My love got so very, very hot. Oh, it absolutely grilled her. The boys shouted in St. Kilda, Mr. Williams, have mercy on Matilda. But when the husband came along with 6 big kids, oh, I felt I could have killed her. I met her. I met her surf bathing. Surf bathing is the greatest thing on earth. I'm going down tomorrow. I'm taking a nice young girl with me, too. Not Matilda, you know. But when the husband came along with 6 big kids, oh, I felt I could have killed her.
Billy Williams, born in Collingwood in 1877, sadly almost worked himself to death. He cut more records than any Australian performer has since, at a time when each recording company probably only produced 100 copies of each disc. He recorded for 50 different recording companies on about 200 titles, and the titles in his discography fill a book that's a quarter of an inch thick. An amazing output. Unfortunately died of liver failure at the age of only 37 in 1915. His last song recorded was Goodbye Ragtime, strangely enough. Best remembered for a song called When Father Papered the Parlour, which people still sing occasionally today. High Edwardian camp. We're almost getting to the time where I throw it open for discussions on VHF on 147.475. So at 11 o'clock, I think we'll open it up for that. In the meantime, I'll search my material for something else I can play to fill the time concerned, and you can see how prepared I'm not. Just to fill the time, this is a forgotten bit of history of Melbourne. The fact that Box Hill, Hawthorne, parts of Hawthorne and Camberwell are dry, have never had a pub. I think not so much Hawthorne, but Camberwell certainly, and Box Hill right out to Blackburn. It's because those particular councils voted to go dry in about 1921. There was an attempt by the Wowsers in Victoria in 1930, in February 1930, to make the whole of Victoria a prohibition state in the same way that America had been during the 20s with their Volstead Act. And people have forgotten how close that came to being enacted. The anti-prohibition movement fortunately had a good advertising campaign and won the day, but not by much. If they'd lost a few more votes, Victoria could have become a Wowsers alcohol-free state. Here is a private recording, a very rare one that I came across in a friend's collection years ago, of a speech broadcast over 3DB in 1930 against Victorian prohibition. And remember, this could have been our state.
Hello, everybody. In view of the approaching statewide poll on prohibition, we are going to provide you with a few expressions of opinions by a representative Melbourne citizen. This is Sir James Barrett, Collins Street specialist and outstanding public figure. The proper way to deal with the misuse of alcohol is to deal with those persons who have not self-control. Fatalities occasioned by the enforcement of prohibition in the United States have averaged 20 killed and 60 wounded a year. The outrages and shootings are causing the most profound concern. It is absolutely impossible to secure a conviction in New York, except in the case of those bootleggers who have been so zealous that the jury felt they had been charging too much for their liquor. Here is Mr. W.E. Jones, Inspector of Inebriate Institutions in Victoria. To what extent it is possible to inculcate rational habits of temperance into a civilized community by legislation alone is more than doubtful. The outstanding fact appears to be that it is more than difficult to make people moral by act of parliament, and that improvement is more likely to be obtained by dealing with the individual delinquent. Our Victorian experience seems to show that a comparatively small population is in the habit of misusing alcohol, but that this small proportion is very persistent and is difficult to cure. listen to the Honorable W. Anglis, MLC. I am not a prohibitionist, largely because I have traveled a great deal in the United States. We know that American jails are crowded to overflowing today, and that there are more criminals and more serious crimes there than in any other part of the civilized world. That is because of prohibition. This is Mr. Harold Fink, Melbourne solicitor and director of the Herald. Inadequate enforcement of the liquor laws has created social evils which alarm thoughtful Americans. A serious problem is the breaking of the liquor laws by persons who used to be law-abiding, but to whom respect for the law is becoming a mockery. In conclusion, let me remind you that it is an imperative duty to go to the poll on March the 29th and record an overwhelming no vote.
But the no vote was only passed by a fraction of the percentage it should have been. I think it was 10% it was passed that they wouldn't go to prohibition. Amazing. Imagine Victoria with every pub being banned from selling alcohol. It almost happened in February 1930. Well, with that, I think we'll go over to the receiver on 147.475. I'll just bring the speaker out and plonk it somewhere near the microphone so that people on air can get something of a mic to speaker patch of whoever might be there. This is VK3AML going over to the receiver. Is anybody listening on 147.475? VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, standing by.
Yeah, VK3CZE, Jamie. Thank you very much, Chris.
No worries, Jamie. Got you on the text there as well as on the radio. Is anybody else listening in there? VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3ACZ as usual. Good evening, Chris.
Yeah, good day, Peter. So we've got Jamie, 3TZE, and Jamie, VK3ACZ. Okay, I'll take you first, Peter. How's your week been? Any comments to make? And I should mention too, for the benefit of people who are maybe interested, we had, as a result of Tom, young Tom, the amateur with the F-call, whose call sign I've forgotten at the moment, Tom organised a field day at Gels Park back on Australia Day, and he's doing the same thing on the 8th of March, Labor Day, at Columbia Park, Wheelers Hill, a field day. So if you turn up there late morning, particularly if you've got a transmitter at Columbia Park, and I believe it's fairly elevated, so VHF might be handy, bring along your Baofeng or whatever. I'm sure Tom wouldn't mind me mentioning that. In fact, he'd probably appreciate it. So back to you, Peter. How's your week been? VK3ACZ with TZE on the side, perhaps with a bit of a pause if any other breakers are there. VK3AML.
Yeah, nothing heard. VK3AML, VK3ACZ. It's been a quiet week. Propagation's been interesting. Sunspots have started to come back, and I had 3 trips to Italy this afternoon on 20 metres, which was good fun. Long path as well. But enjoyed the broadcast. Not any part of it more than another, but just love your contributions to our knowledge and our entertainment. And I'm going to do something I don't normally do, which is I can't hang around tonight. I've got to get a real early one, and I'm weary and I'm nearly falling asleep in the chair. Hope that's okay. The call sign you're looking for is FTOM, FTOM. Young fella, and it was good meeting up with you and all the others at Gels Park. What was that, Australia Day, was it? Yes, it must have been Australia Day, because we all had the funny call signs, hi. Anyway, what sort of week have you had there, Chris? Back to you quickly. VK3AML, VK3ACZ.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, VK3ACZ and the group VK3AML. Fairly quiet week, gathering stills and research material for the videos I'm putting together on the Deal Island trip. Unlike Dave, who's done a more or less a news coverage of all the things we did, I'm trying to make some sort of a historical documentary out of the material that I've got, because I was filming a lot of the historical aspects of Bass Strait, the places where the sealers had been before the establishment of Melbourne. For example, the little cove that we had our camp in, Garden Cove on the north end of Deal Island, was a sealers' camp in 1806, a good 30 years before Melbourne was founded. It's a strange collection of people among the sealers, because they were people who in many cases had tried to escape beyond the reach of the law, which was fairly heavy-handed in those days, and a lot of people were in Australia against their will, needless to say. So Bass Strait was a good place to disappear into at that stage, with Hobart a mere village, Melbourne not yet thought of, even Portland not yet thought of. In fact, there are graves, both documented and undocumented, around Deal Island and the other little Bass Strait islands that are no longer inhabited. In terms of historical research, it's a fascinating area, because it was very much more active in terms of European population at the turn of the 19th century than it is now, 220 years later. I'll hand it round to Jamie, VK3TZE. How have you been, Jamie, VK3AML?
Yeah, pretty good. Haven't done my antennas that I plan to do, but I will be doing that. I've been mostly in the shack, in the garage, organising stuff there, pulling out what doesn't work and what does work, and rewiring it inside the shack. So I've got different radios inside the shack, and power supply and that power supply. Don't look like a really easy to use shack. I can sit in, don't look like a really easy, and control different radios from the same position. So that's a lot easier than the messier one. That's a lot easier than most of the wires are hidden. So yeah, I've been doing that. Haven't done easy power for a while. Probably getting into that. I'll get back into that. But I packed that all the way about a month or before Christmas, I think. Can't remember. But no, I heard you on tonight, and I heard tonight, and I got on, and I was quite in there tonight, and I got on, and on a weekly basis. Over.
Yeah, no worries. Somebody was obviously listening off the stream, off the internet stream, and dropped a couple of carriers there, and I could tell from that my internet stream is delayed about a second and a half from what's going out. So it's interesting. Some weeks we've had a 10-second delay on the internet stream, not so much tonight. So whoever that was that relayed that, thank you. So are there any others who... thank you for that too, Jamie, and best of luck with your antennas and all that. It's probably a good time to get stuck into all that if you do have the time. With the shut-ins and whatnot, now finally the shops are open again. We can get access to stuff to do that sort of thing. In fact, the Annan digital rig that I've been looking at is, since we last spoke, a local supplier has become agent for it, so it's made it considerably cheaper for me to get it, and I have considerably more chance of getting recourse if anything goes wrong, to have stuff returned under warranty. So all good. So background to Peter, I guess, for a final, but in the meantime, with a pause for anybody else who'd like to break in. VK3ACZ, with a pause for any breakers, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML, VK3ACZ. Yeah, it wasn't me dropping that carrier. I thought it must have been coming from you, because I didn't notice much of a delay at all. Yeah, I didn't run my internet connection tonight because that's in the main house and not in the shack. But you've never been any closer than 6 seconds behind when I've been monitoring, but then that's coming over the phone system. I don't know whether that makes any difference. Don't know enough about it. Yeah, I'm going to have to get out of here because I'm wilting fast. But no reflection on your broadcast tonight, Chris, I assure you, because no, I was up very early. The phone rang at some awful o'clock that I didn't even know or I'd forgotten existed. Hi. But anyway, wish you well and look forward to catching up with your broadcast again next week. So cheers and 7-3. VK3AML, VK3ACZ.
No other breakers. VK3ACZ, VK3AML. Thanks, Peter. Have a good sleep. I understand completely about those sort of things where you get woken up early. I've had a couple of days where I had to get up extremely early, by my standards now in retirement, to head in for an 8 o'clock appointment with the doctor. I had a bit of a blood test today because I had, you may notice, I've got a bit of a scar across here, if you can see it on the YouTube. I had a thing called a hemithyroidectomy. One part of my thyroid is developing into a goiter and was cutting off my air supply about 10 years ago, so I had it removed. And while there was no problem immediately after the operation, I have to be monitored for thyroxine in my blood. The remaining half of my thyroid on the left side of the vocal cords is apparently generating enough natural thyroxine. I don't have to have any chemical substitutes, so I've been lucky. But it could go the other way, so they do checkups on me, and usually they pick the least convenient time of the day to do it. But as it's being done on the public health system that I've paid through my taxes over a 45-year period for, I suppose, I might as well make use of it rather than going for the full private thing. Anyway, round to Jamie again, with a pause for anybody else who'd like to break in. Obviously, other people are listening in. We have 11, would you believe, 11 on the stream. I think this might be telling me something about the advisability for putting effort into the internet stream as well as the radio when I'm contemplating the 80-metre outlet with the Annan transceiver in addition to the 2-metre outlet. Starting to think that putting more effort into OBS software so that I can insert video clips and stills into the weekly YouTube live stream might be better. And the YouTube live stream stays up as a recording for about a week until I take it off and replace it with the next one. If anybody on the YouTube live stream would like to come up, we're on 147,475. I'll just... I keep on miscuing tonight, and you might have noticed I made a few miscues because I've got two mouse keys sitting on the desk here, and I invariably reach for the wrong bloody one. One controls the computer that's doing the YouTube live video streaming. The other one controls the playback machine, the second machine over here on my right, for those of you who are watching. Because I have to separate the two functions. The act of video streaming tends to require a lot of CPU power, so I don't want to be running playback on the same machine. So I use the other machine, the second machine, the Windows 10 small machine, for playing back audio into this computer and mixer system on my left. So round to Jamie, VK3TZE. Anything else to report, Jamie? Has there been any reopening of the EMDRC rooms, for example? VK3TZE and the group VK3AML.
I'll just give a break for anyone that wants to call in. Nothing heard. Yeah, club rooms are open. I've missed the last 2 Thursdays. One I was not locked down, but I had to see doctors, and I was on semi-lockdown. And then last Thursday Leighton Open, and I didn't go because I had a family issue. I had to go and look after the grandson with the wife, so we did that. The club's open on the Thursdays, and we're looking at reopening on the Saturday, so we had to cancel the barbecue because of COVID and lack of people to run the barbecue under a COVID-safe program. So we decided not to. It was too early just after the lockdown was released, or lifted, I should say. So yeah, I think we'll be looking in the good weather, still good weather, so we'll probably be looking at a monthly barbecue. Get more people down there and more outdoor activities rather than in the shack area. But no, things are coming along all right at the moment. Now we've got less restrictions, like you said. You can go out and do coffee stuff, meet up with small groups and things like that. So yeah, there's more activity out and about, but I'd prefer to stay home and fix up stuff I've got to do there. Plus I'm lazy too. But if I didn't stay home with the radio and have the radios working, I wouldn't have heard tonight. So yeah. And I'm assuming that you do this on a weekly basis. I'll make this my final, but I believe you do it every Saturday night. Over.
Yeah, look, I try to, Jamie, VK3TZE, and I don't think it's a group anymore. I think Peter's headed off to bed. All the best to you, Peter, if you're still listening. I try to do it as many Saturdays as I can, but I don't become a slave to it. If my wife has organised something of a social nature and we have friends involved, well, it's not the sort of thing that I can automate in the way that Dave VK3ASE used to automate his. He was just purely playing material if he was unavailable personally. Whereas to operate this video stream and the audio playback, I really have to be here. So you can be assured that I'm at the station and live if you see this. Unless, of course, you're watching this video stream on YouTube as a recording at a time other than Saturday night, Sunday morning. The length of the transmission varies from week to week. We start every Saturday night at 9:30 on 147.475. I've chosen the time. Dave used to start at 10:30, but at my advancing years, I find 10:30 start with a 1:30 finish a little bit too taxing. So pushing it back to 9:30, I think, makes it better for people. I also restrict any musical content, although it's completely legal, particularly if it's out of copyright, and that stuff over 100 years old, I can assure you, is so far out of copyright, it is just ridiculous. But since the reframing of the Radio Communications Act, music per se is not outlawed, as it was in the old Wireless Telegraphy Act. There are a variety of reasons for that, chiefly that the ATV repeater people applied at the time of the change of the Act to run instructional videos, and if you're running instructional videos, how-to videos, of film particularly, that have a musical backing behind the narration track, there's not much bloody you can do about it unless you transmit the music. I don't make music a feature of these sessions. I think that probably would be asking for trouble, not so much because it's against the law, but because you get the Mother Grundy types who think that they know everything about the regs. And the trouble is they know everything about the regs as of 1970. And the things have changed. There are all sorts of reasons for that. The regs particularly have changed in terms of monopoly and preserving the secrecy of shortwave transmissions. Now that there's more than one service provider for telecommunications in Australia, and everybody has a computer which they can use for internet communications worldwide, the idea of monopolising the whole communication system through one authority, the PMG as it used to be, is ludicrous in the modern context. So things have loosened up quite a bit, and I hope I'm not abusing the privilege, but occasionally where material is musical and germane to a conversation or historical documentary material, well, that's what we go for. VK3TZE with a pause, VK3AML. If anybody else would like to break in, please do so now.
VK3AML, VK3TZE returning. Yeah, looks like more listeners than talkers tonight. Yeah, okay, I hope to be on next weekend. It's a long weekend. I haven't got plans as such, but like the wife makes the decisions and then on short notice. Like tomorrow, she took the battery for a golf buggy upstairs tonight, so that means usually means the next day she's playing golf. So it looks like I've got a day off tomorrow so I can get more cleaning done. Yep. Or watch more Netflix. And then Tuesday she's probably playing golf too. So yeah, we'll see how. Yeah, I might be able to pop over for an hour, so it'd be good.
Thank you, Goff.
Yeah. All right, I'll make this final. I'll give 73 or 73 for now, and thank you very much, Chris. VK3AML, VK3TZE, please.
Yeah, we had an interesting break there from Gough Whitlam, speaking from beyond the grave. Over the top of you briefly. Saving the Governor-General. I hope Gough and the Governor-General are shaking hands in the hereafter. They certainly weren't on that day. Anyway, I remember the day, actually, November the 11th, 1975. I was making my first programs for, let me see, a listener named Don Campbell on our text chat says, Chris, how do you get visibility of your next week's and following week's discussion topic? I don't know. I pick it from week to week. I just came across the lecture by Associate Professor Felicity Cox on the development of the Australian accent, and I had sufficient material to throw together a night's material on that. But I just sort of pick a topic out of the blue, Don Campbell. If you're saying how do you get visibility of next week's discussion, well, if I knew that, I'd look in on the Melbourne Cup and start voting for the winner of the Cup before it runs. But no, I honestly, the topics that I choose. Royza, thank you. Subscribe and turn on the bell icon and select all. The bell icon is next to the subscribe button. Yeah, that will tell you that I'm on. And occasionally through the week I come on testing and whatnot, and I intend to be doing some tests with a new communications platform called OBS software, which will allow me to insert stills and video clips with this stream. And it would be nice if I can actually insert the video of which Dave, I, and Stephen 3SL all shot on Deal Island in January, and just talk you through it and answer any questions you might have about the place from the video as it runs. But at the moment with YouTube Live, all I can run is the webcam. I can't, and this microphone and the mixer. But even that seems to be a little bit awry, because apparently when I turn the microphone down on the mixer, the radio transmitter doesn't get the audio. But the YouTube live stream still does by means that I completely don't understand. I just hope it's not coming through the webcam mic, because that is rather substandard. I'm hoping it's coming through this mic, which I'm using for broadcasting, and I'm listening to the signals off air from a desktop scanner up on a shelf to my left. Okay. Do we have any other breakers on 147.475? Anybody on the stream who'd like to have a chat? We've got a lot of people on 10 or 12, actually, from time to time on YouTube Live, on VK3AML Live. If you care to put those two words, VK3AML Live, into Google search or into YouTube, you'll find us on there. Is there anybody else who'd like to have a chat on radio? VK3AML standing by on 147.475. Not even a pirate? Many ears, no talk. Okay, Jamie, I'll hand it over to you for a final, and then if nobody else comes on, I might start to wind up for the night or play a few more records before pulling the big switch. VK3TZE, VK3AML.
Yeah, thanks very much once again. Yeah, I'm going to go off and watch a movie where Australia moves. The Riddle of the Stinson. That starts off in an aeroplane, and I think it was, it says there 1987. But some well-known actors in it, very well-known actors. You've probably seen it. All right, I'm going QRT. I will have the radio on in the background, though. Thank you very much once again, and I'll catch you during the week, I hope. Over.
No worries, Jamie, and thanks for coming on. Riddle of the Stinson, I actually met a newsreel cameraman who covered that, and it wasn't 1987, it was 1937. It happened in the border ranges between New South Wales and Queensland at a place called O'Reilly's, or it's near a place called O'Reilly's. Stinson airliner came down in the border ranges jungle, and Bernard O'Reilly, who ran the guest house at O'Reilly's, which still exists, still runs, organised a rescue team to go, I think it was about a 20-kilometre walk through very thick jungle to get to the wreck, where they managed to recover, I think, 2 of the 4 survivors or something. I did meet many years ago one of the news cameramen for Cinesound, who went in and filmed the wreck a couple of days after they located the survivors. It's a very interesting film. I can thoroughly recommend it, he said, chasing people off the stream. I should know better. Does anybody else like to come up for a chat, or shall I go back to recorded material? This is VK3AML putting a final call out on 147.475.
1990, no Australian child will be living in poverty.
Well, that was the biggest bad quote that Bob Hawke ever made. By 1990, no Australian child will be living in poverty. Fairyland. I don't often vote for them, you know. I don't often vote for either of the major parties, if the truth be known. The next thing, there'll be somebody screaming at me, "You're a communist," or something similar as they want to do. Let's look for something that I can play for a while. Sydney Columbia Factory, Olsen and Johnson, just looking for something that I can play here. Not much on that file. I didn't really this is a little bit of Dave 3ASE, who always runs high. Oh, wait a minute. No, I won't play that. This is a poem that I've played several times in the past. People seem to like this for some strange reason. It's a poem about plastic stacker chairs.
Most people have got a few plastic stacker chairs at their place. You know, those plastic ones that've got the little splits in the seat. What you probably don't know about these chairs is that when you sit on them, those splits open up because that's happening underneath your bum and you don't see. And when you stand up, they close up again. But they can be a bit tricky, those chairs. And I've written this poem about a person who got into a bit of strife with a plastic stacker chair. And I've called the poem Entrapment. And the expanded title is The Terrifying but Tragically True Tale of Trevor's Trapped Testicle. Trevor's on a mission to Consumer Affairs, trying to get a total ban on plastic stacker chairs. He reckons that they're dangerous, a serious threat to life, because it was through a plastic chair that he got into strife. It was at the Tamworth Festival, a concert in the park. Trev and Ken were there with gear to last them until dark. An esky full of coldies. Trev was without a care. Stubbies, thongs and t-shirt on his plastic stacker chair. But as he stretched his legs out, his left crown jewel rolled free and dropped straight through the chair seat, a real catastrophe. But Trevor remained unaware of his dire situation until they gave the singer a big standing ovation. As Trevor came up to his feet, he gave a fearsome yell, because tethered to his testicle, the chair came up as well. He grabbed the chair with both hands as they crashed back to the ground, but the errant family jewel was firmly stuck, he quickly found. He tried to extract the enclosed clod, but he began to curse, because nothing he did seemed to work. It only made things worse. Trev's mate Ken was laughing, fit to go right off his brain. Ken's tears were from laughter, but Trevor's were from pain. Ken produced a Stanley knife, and Trevor's mouth went dry. He said, "I'll only cut the chair," but Trevor wouldn't let him try. Well, Ken climbed underneath the chair and tried to poke things through. It's times like this you find out what your mates will really do. They pulled and poked and prodded, but all efforts were in vain. Trevor's nut was red and raw and giving heaps of pain. All this unwanted attention was no good, you realise. Trevor's tortured testicle swelled up to twice its size. Well, the word spread quickly through the park about the situation, and people tried to get a glimpse of Trev's threatened castration. Mums and dads and kids and dogs of every shape and age. Trev got more attention than the singer on the stage. Little kids were pointing, dogs were trying to have a smell, and Trevor, trying to cover up, said, "Go to bloody hell." Poor bloke needs an ice pack was the only good advice. They sat Trev over his esky with his agate in the ice. Someone called an ambulance and they drove through the crowd. Trev was drinking Bundy rum and swearing very loud. When they both stopped laughing, they carted Trev away to the hospital where he became the highlight of the day. But Trevor's near recovered with both crown jewels in place. Don't offer him a plastic chair if you value your face. But next year at the carnival, Trevor will be there, wearing tight undies, long trousers, on his canvas fold-out chair.
That's one of the very few items that I really respect from the Tamworth Country Music Festival, the plastic stacker chair. And incidentally, that's not plastic behind me at the moment. There's nowhere the jewels can fall through. This is VK3AML. Do we have any breakers on 147.475? Standing by for any calls. No, okay. Well, as a final item, a curio. Let's just have a look here. What can I play? An Edison advertising cylinder from 1906. It may be advertising, which is illegal by modern standards, but of course the Edison company, as far as records go, stopped trading in October 1929. So there's no point in trying to buy an Edison phonograph if you want to. But here is the advertisement.
I am the Edison phonograph, created by the great wizard of the New World to delight those who would have melody or be amused. I can sing you tender songs of love. I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter. I can transport you to the realms of music. I can cause you to join in the rhythmic dance. I can lull the babe to sweet repose, or waken in the aged heart soft memories of youthful days. No matter what may be your mood, I am always ready to entertain you. When your day's work is done, I can bring the theater or the opera to your home. I can give you grand opera, comic opera, or vaudeville. I can give you sacred or popular music, band, orchestra, or instrumental music. I can render solos, duets, trios, quartets. I can aid in entertaining your guests. When your wife is worried after the cares of the day and the children are boisterous, I can rest the one and quiet the other. I never get tired, and you will never tire of me, for I always have something new to offer. I give pleasure to all, young and old. I will go wherever you want me, in the parlor, in the sick room, on the porch, in the camp, or to your summer home. If you sing or talk to me, I will retain your songs or words and repeat them to you at your pleasure. I can enable you to always hear the voices of your loved ones, even though they are far away. I talk in every language. I can help you to learn other languages. I am made with the highest degree of mechanical skill. My voice is the clearest, smoothest, and most natural of any talking machine. The name of my famous master is on my body and tells you that I am a genuine Edison phonograph. The more you become acquainted with me, the better you will like me. Ask the dealer.
I'll be listening on 147.475. But meantime,
Roll me down, hop, skip, a jumpity jump in the sea. Rodeo, hop, skip, you're up in your coat, wearing fine clothes, everyone knows. Hop, skip, you're jumping in back of a knee. Rodeo, what I'd give to be back on that street where you danced with me in your bare feet. Be careful, hop, skip, the sweet little sound. My own little gal, forgetting her pal. Hop, skip, you better start jumping with me.
for the last 2 hours, you've been listening to VK3 Alpha Mike Lima on 147.475, our regular Saturday night bilge session, test transmission from 9:30 to usually midnight. We're going to cut off a little bit earlier tonight. I can't get anybody to come back to me on 475, though there are currently 10 people on the internet stream on VK3AML Live. seems a pity to abandon it at this stage, but nevertheless, we'll be back next Saturday night at 9:30 p.m. and hopefully there'll be a few more people on 2 meters. Good night, Royza. Good night, Don Campbell, Kaza Lambretta, Jamie Hall. Looking up the list here, Tilly Gmail, and quite a few others. Mike Groth, if you're still listening there. So thank you for coming along. Glad that some people are responding favourably to the content, and we kept this going through the COVID shut-in, and it seems a pity to abandon it now simply because people are less likely to be on the air. Obviously, people are more likely to be watching on YouTube Live, which perhaps is sending a message to me. So, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima concluding on YouTube Live, and I'll listen very briefly on 147.475.